It's working. It's just that you
No,
mentioned.
no, I meant.
Let me just start today off. I know it's a bad time because we have exams starting from tomorrow for the masters as well. But welcome to the Dean's 70th Anniversary Lecture Series of our School of International Studies. Today is the 14th lecture and the last one for this semester.
And the best one.
And the best one. But these lectures, especially for you, Murray, these are a celebration of the completion of 70 years of our school.
Oh, wonderful.
Which was, we take it back to, excuse me, take it back to October of 1955, when the Indian School of International Studies was established at Indian Council of World Affairs.
Okay.
So, and this is even before JNU was established. So it merged with JNU in 1970, the school as School of International Studies. We've had 13 lectures so far since October of last year, ranging from international studies in India, Nobel Prize in economics, international law, India's development, its foreign policy, its quest for status in international politics, China's foreign policy, Trump administration in West Asia, US and South Asia, AI-based digital technologies, and so on and so forth. Lectures, all these lectures have been delivered by our alumni, reputed international analysts, distinguished professors, academics, and some of our former professors of this school. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Professor Marie McAndrew. She is Professor Emeritus at University of Montreal. Marie has been Rector and Special Advisor on Equity, Diversion, and Inclusion at the University of Montreal. She is an internationally recognized scholar in the field of education of minorities and comparative education. She's published numerous books, including Immigration and Diversity in Schools. This book had won the Donner Prize in 2001 for the best book on Canadian public policy. Another one of her books, Fragile Majorities and Education, was nominated for the Governor General Awards in 2010. And she's received numerous distinctions in recognition of the impacts of her work, including the Order of Canada in 2018, honoris causa doctorate from Université du Québec in 2021. But more than anything else, Marie, of course, is very close. She's a close friend and has been with us at the center for almost about 2 decades now.
Yes.
Frequently visiting, and we organized several events together. So she's going to be, of course, speaking on the future of Canadian multiculturalism in troubled times today. Very opportune moment because we just had Canadian elections, federal elections on the 28th of April. So I won't take very long because I will like to hand over to the chair of the session today, Professor Sahadevan, who is chairperson of the South Asian Studies, Center for South Asian Studies. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor Singh, and very delighted to welcome Professor Marie McAndrew, an outstanding scholar, as Preeti has, sort of mentioned everything about her CV. He also said there's a very long association with the Center for Canadian, used to be Canadian, United States and Latin American Studies. I know Professor Nalfe is here. I think it's a sort of institution builder in terms of bringing up the Canadian studies here. I know we used to have a lunch meeting with Professor McAndrew those days. Professor Nalfe, Professor Christopher Raj, KP Vijayalakshmi, Preeti. So I mean, I told Preeti in the morning. I think this huge sort of a memory in a way of associating with Professor McAndrew.
Absolutely.
So welcome back to the school and the center, and delighted to have you here. And it's a very interesting subject in a way. I think it's we hardly speak about multiculturalism, it is facing a huge, tremendous challenges all over the world. It's not a troubled time; it's a terribly bad time for multiculturalism. So I think we'll look forward to your insightful lecture on the theme, which is dear to you and dear to many of us here. So over to you, Professor McNamara.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Devan. And I want to acknowledge also the good organization done by the Center, Priti Singh and Akajita, that I always get problem with your name, and my old friend, Professor Nafe. I also apologize for those who were there for the conference of December. There'll be a few common elements, but not so much in this lecture. First, I want to make clear also, I'm not a study of international relations, and my knowledge of multiculturalism has come because I've always been very involved in policy development, not only in education. My main research was on education, but I've worked with government, both federal and provincial. I was one of the advisors for the Quebec interculturalism policy in the 90s, and later on I sat in many committees, and I've always been in center where we were looking at issues of multiculturalism from different disciplines. So today won't be based so much on research as much as the knowledge of the policy. Maybe I can change. So I thought it was a little ambitious to start about the future, because we...
Am I blocking the...
Do you see it?
Yes.
I think, we all know that social science unfulfilled prediction could fill this room. We are not very good at making prediction. So that's why I felt I will keep the last part for the prediction. And I will go back a little bit about conceptual issues and also actual description of what is Canadian multiculturalism policy. Because already from the comments I heard from Professor Devan, I can see that multiculturalism is so many things to so many people that we can pronounce at the same time its failure and its success depending on where you are and what you're speaking about. So I thought it would be interesting to look at this a little bit more in international perspective before we get into Canada. So that will be the third part. So obviously, in the international forum, multiculturalism as a policy. And again, I want to say, I'm not going to be discussing multiculturalism as a sociological fact. That's something else, but as a policy. What I would say first thing is that that the failure of multiculturalism has been pronounced every year since I've been active in the field, since, let's say, the 1990s. And it's usually announced, especially in countries we never implemented multiculturalism. If you take Europe, for example, very few countries really had a policy of multiculturalism. Maybe Britain a little bit, but it was in enough. And so France pronounced that it was a failure, and France never had multiculturalism. So the problem is that people take what you call a scapegoat or a strawman, a strawman, and they build into multiculturalism whatever fits their strawman, so they can accuse it of all the wrongs in the world. So what are the assumed pervert effects? Multiculturalism would ghettoize, it would isolate, it would exclude. It would support the maintenance of traditional rights, rigid identities, a promotion of fundamentalism. It would have a negative impact on women and children within some subgroups, especially within immigrant communities. And this very known French, I'm translating from French, but le droit à la différence et la différence des droits. So the right to difference equals difference in rights. So these are the basic things you see in the debate. And again, what I want to argue is that there's very little actually research on multiculturalism. So all those pervert effects are actually mostly undocumented. And when they are documented, they are not distinguished from the impact of other policies. For example, if you have in a country, you have a planned and selected immigration, like we have in Canada, you may overestimate the benefit of multiculturalism, while actually the good economic success is linked more to the fact that you did plan and select immigrants. And on the reverse, when you go in places like Europe or where they did not promote selecting immigrant until 10 years ago, basically they would say multiculturalism caused the high level of employment, for example. So obviously, or the fact that people did not identify as citizens very highly or kept very strong identities of origin, they would say it's because of multiculturalism. But actually, if you look in Europe, for France, for example, the reason why most people did not identify as French people was that until very recently, there was the idea of the return to the country. So it was not pushed very much. So again, is multiculturalism linked to a permanent settlement immigration policy? Or is it linked to a return to the country of origin? Some countries have used multiculturalism to be sure that the immigrant could be sent back. Let's encourage their culture and their language. Let them study in their own language. So then when we want to get rid of them, we can ship them back. I would be curious to see, for example, the Trump administration now that is trying to convince people to pay for their own, get money for their own return. Maybe he won't be against the teaching of Spanish in school because he will say that it would be easier to send them back to Mexico if they have those bilingual programs. So this has been a major issue. So again, is it multiculturalism or is it the other policy you're aiming? And do you have an integration policy or not? Which is because normally an integration policy of immigrants is not the same thing as a multiculturalism policy. I'll show that in the case of Canada. I put my little definition of multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is a normative position which recognizes the importance of different dimensions of belonging, whether it be culture, language, religion, race. But these dimensions of identities and belonging, they apply to citizens who share a common political community. And again, we'll always see this difficult balance between what's the sharing of a common political community and what is the place of different identities. And we also, in the multiculturalism policy, you normally also recognize that those dimensions must be taken in the definition of policies and programs. So that will be the two parts. As an identity, you recognize that even if people are part of a common political community, they may have sense of belonging linked to various markers. And on the other hand, you're looking at this should have an impact on the way you plan policy. So having said so, there's multiple multicultural ideology, practices, and discourses. And I would say not only difference across country, but difference within the same countries. And that is very obvious in the Canadian case, not only because we have Quebec and the native people, but basically in any society, when you have an ideology, for example, I would be theoretically India is unity in diversity. But the way in which this is implemented, I don't know, in a state like Assam, as opposed to a state in Delhi, certainly very different. But even in the same state, you would go in the school, and the school won't have the same outlook. So we always have to be careful that we have to look at the real policy. But having said that, some dimension of variation can be: are you stressing that culture are dynamic, changing? Are you stressing that they're static? At the academia, we always say it's dynamic, but when you look actually at policy implementation, including at militancy, often for militant, it is a good weapon in the not in the actual sense, but in the symbolic sense, to use their culture as static. That is what we are. So again, you have to look at this dimension. Is it the group that is bearer of rights, or is it the individual? You might find very interesting discussion about, like, for example, in school, if I refer to school, if the community asks girls to wear a hijab, as opposed to the individual girl deciding or not to wear it. And what's the role of a school teacher in this area? So again, you would see that saying that difference exists doesn't tell us who has the right to difference. Important. Also, how much stress should be put on intercultural exchanges, as opposed to the maintenance of culture. And we'll see again in the Canadian case that I think we're heading towards a time where we're going to put more stress on intercultural exchanges. But this varies over time. It often depends on the political situation, obviously. Does the policy stress limits to accommodation of diversity, or is it vague? And finally, do we put forward ethnocultural markers, or do we acknowledge that before and in parallel to ethnocultural markers, there are other markers that could also have an impact on their life experience? I'm interested to see, for example, how much social class is put forward in Europe. And ethnicity is almost a taboo. In some places, you're not even able to gather the data, administrative data about the origin of people. And as opposed in North America, the taboo is social class. Social class don't exist. You don't ask people what their job is, whatever. But asking your ethnicity is perfectly correct, and collecting data. So again, but normally when we do research, especially, but even at the level of policy implementation, we must look into how are the different markers of difference interweave. I'm not even speaking of women, but these are the three main dimensions of variation. And again, I know in India you're having debate about should the reservation be based on class or be based on status, not ethnic, but tribal or caste status. So again, whenever we're looking at a policy, we have to unveil all this before we can really look at what it is about. So now if I turn to the Canadian case, I will start by, I would give overall a very positive evaluation, but I will come to some limits. It doesn't change. Oh, sorry. And that was okay. I just forgot this one. We were on the same, no problem. So I think the main interesting thing about Canadian multiculturalism is that it has existed for more than 50 years. It became an official policy in 1970. And it's not that often that policies survive so long. And I think it is due to its capacity to adapt. It's a very changing policy. The multiculturalism policy of 1970 has very little to do with the one even of 1990, of 2010, and the one would be coming later in the year to come. In 1970, it was basically a reaction to the Bilingual and Biculturalism Commission. We had, at that time, Quebec's separatist movement was growing, so the federal government created a commission to enhance biculturalism and bilingualism. And some of the ethnic group, not immigrant group, people who had been there for 2-3 generations, mostly German, Ukrainian, Eastern Europe people from the west of Canada, they objected not to bilingualism, but to biculturalism. They said we've been there. I mean, at the scale of Canada, the fact that the French they're there for 300 years and then the immigrants 100 years doesn't make such a huge difference. So they were saying basically we've been there and we've contributed to Canada. And one of the commissioners was a Ukrainian, and he published a minority report. And finally, the government find a very Canadian type of compromise. So we are a multicultural country within a bilingual framework. It doesn't mean that we don't support minority other languages, but they're not official languages. It was stating that neither English nor French culture was the official culture. So that's the way it was done. But the important thing is that even in 1970, it was never an integration policy for newcomers. It was not aimed at integrating newcomers because those communities, they had been in the West since the major wave before the First World War. The major immigration to Canada, like in the US, it's the end of 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, before the first 1970. So it was more like an identity policy so that everybody would feel integrated, whatever their background was, and not an integration policy. One of the weaknesses maybe too good, it doesn't have a very strong integration policy. it came to be used by some people as a proxy for integration policy. And obviously, in times of very high level of immigration and it's not well adjusted to integrate people if they don't know their country, telling them already that they're part of it and that their identity is part of it, but they don't know what they're part of what. So it was not aimed for that. But what we saw is that sometimes it's thought about like a song and dance approach. We used to, but it hasn't been song and dance approach for at least 45 years. It got to be a much more sophisticated vision of identities and culture. And when we did a study about how the money was spent, there was actually not very little money spent on linguistic and cultural maintenance of group, and most of the money was more like empowerment of either ethnic communities or even mainstream institutions to adapt to diversity. So the program was really, the focus was really help us change. So we'll give money to the Association of Bengali Women, not so that they would do Bengali craft and stay between themselves. I have nothing against Bengali or Bengali craft or Bengali women, but they will enhance their rights in women's movement, or they will develop instruments to know how to help better their children in school. So the focus is always participation in society. And this is overwhelming, although as an ideology, often people would imagine the 1st of July, the celebration with all those dancers, but it's not a song and dance policy. And also, it has been able to adapt to different markers. When it started, it was really culture, white, I would say white European culture. Then later, race, in quote unquote, as a sociological concept, became very important with the coming of visible minority to Canada. So issues of racism were dealt more. And after 9/11, religion became a very important issue because, again, it was both a factor of exclusion, but it could also be a factor of auto-exclusion, so it was important. And what we saw under the Harper government in the year 2000, and after 9/11 also, so both can be linked, is that the strengthening of common civic identity became an important theme. Before we go back to the Trudeau era, which I'll delve more in the limits, where we got into a very post-national, disembodied type of discourse. But during the year, both at the last year of the Chrétien and especially during our government, the idea that multiculturalism was part of a civic identity got more momentum. So just tell you that in 50 years, you can see that it's always trying to find a balance between competing objectives. When we look at the impact, overall, we can say that Canadian institution is not perfect. I'll go with the limit later. But Canadian society and institution, because I'm more interested in public institution, but also public opinion, they really evolve in 50, 60 years towards inclusion and higher recognition of pluralism without major tension. I'm not saying there's no debate. I'm not saying there's no resistance. But when you look at Canada in 2025, compared to what the Anglo-conformity was in 1970, you can see that the policy has globally helped to make this change because it changed. It was adaptive policy. And when you look at the climate of ethnic relation in Canada, when you compare to other contexts, there's limit again, but the climate is rather good. And I would say also that with all the limits I'll cover later, it certainly contributes a certain extent to the indicators of integration of immigrants and their descendants in the middle and longer run. It also has been very popular with other federal government, other level of government, even the government who oppose the policy like Quebec have their own policy. And at the level of cities, so you can see that everybody has invented their little multiculturalism policy. And in civil society, when we look at the public opinion, for example, about the policy, when you ask the question about the support for the policy, it's usually more than 60%. But if you break the policy in its smaller aims, then the support is much higher. So multiculturalism has a negative, not a negative, but they're more resistance to multiculturalism. But if you say, do you agree that people should be participation of people of our origin to public institutions should be support? Do you agree that we should support the language, maintenance of language and culture of immigrant groups, provided that they learn French or English? Do you support we should fight racism? Do you support we should get information about intercultural exchange and education? The support is always very high, although the policy itself may be a little less. And again, until the shift of 2015, we could even say that it had been a protective factor against the negative impact of globalization about national identities. By making multiculturalism its identity, Canadian identity, it was making a shelter against the dissolution of identities that could have happened under immigration flux. But there are some limits. Am I okay? Okay. There are, as maybe because it's a successful policy, it's also a very ambiguous policy. So part of what I'm stating as a limit, as an academic, could be maybe some politician would say it's the art of the deal, being ambiguous and changing. But still, there's always been some resistance against from the deep diversity sector. What we call that deep diversity, a concept from Kim Licka, political scientist, you must know, is that you have immigration diversity, which is relatively recent, and you have in countries deep diversity. I would agree in India, most of the time your diversity is deep. Deep means that it comes from long historical roots. In Canada, it's only 400 years, but for the native people, it's 10,000 years. So especially native people, linguistic minority, French minorities, and Quebec, didn't feel at ease. First of all, the policy did not know what to do with the deep diversity. Sometimes they would refer to it, but most of the time they knew that those groups don't want to be the subject of the multiculturalism policy. So that way, but at the same time, resisting the multiculturalism policy did not mean that those groups did not develop their own multicultural policy as welcoming community. So they didn't want to be included as subject of the policy, but they were ready to look at how do we deal as welcoming community. The later to react was the native community because they're more homogeneous. But more recently, if you get to see this movie, that just went out, there's been a movie about Shefferville, which is a very, very remote place. There used to be a mining town there, and now it's closed, but the native people kept the place. You can go there by train. I'll bring you whenever you want. It's very interesting. But just to say, they made a movie recently, a documentary, and what they find out is that 100% of the community is native, and 100% of the teachers are from Africa. And unlike the white people from the south who come for 2 years and go back because the north is not very appealing, those people have been there for 15, 20 years. So you actually have a multicultural community up north in the native community up north Quebec, where all the people who teach in the school are from Black Africa, southern Africa, not southern, but south of Sahara Africa. So and same thing for the French minority. Quebec also has an old intercultural policy. But still, the people, they don't relate to multiculturalism as the federal policy, but they find ways into getting multiculturalism themselves. Certainly, the politicians have flirted a lot with cultural relativism, and sometimes they would recognize that there could be potential conflict between multiculturalism and other democratic value. But it's a kind of a touchy thing that people will... often it will be used and it will be instrumentalized, or it will be silenced. Very rarely does it being discussed in a I would say a reasonable and balanced way. we do know that some people are misusing some fund, or even not the fund, just the ideology of multiculturalism to promote fundamentalism, or even worse. But can we document that without looking at it as an instrumental matter? We have this issue, for example, in 30 schools in Quebec, where there was report that people were actually not teaching all the subject, because the majority of the parents and the teacher was from one background, and they didn't teach some of the curriculum. They didn't treat girls the same way, and so in quote unquote, they did not recognize special education. They felt that the student must be disciplined and not having access to services. But then when you look at the report, it showed that it was a lot of cultural values and a little bit of religious value. But when the politician used it, they stress only the religious component of it. But there is a problem to find this, to document this. And I was mentioning, yes, the place of religion, especially. Because why religion is so contentious with multiculturalism? Maybe because religion is more, first of all, a personal choice. You can renounce your religion. It's very difficult to renounce your race because you're still visible. So in a way, it seems like people make a choice, which is not always true, but they can make a choice about religion. And the other thing is that religion has very, when your values come from God, they are not so much amenable to compromise. And normally, a multicultural pluralistic society has to be based on compromise. And so it's one area that if you're advocating your culture is less an imperative as your religion. So that's why it's a complex situation, and we have two models of secularism in Canada. One is more like the Indian model, which is more like the state out of the religious thing, but a lot of tolerance of religious expression. And in Quebec, secularism, which it's not as strict as French secularism, but still keeping for example, you're not allowed to wear any religious gear if you're teaching in a school in Quebec, while you would be allowed if you teach in a school in Ontario. So the debate around religion is not finished for sure. And what I would say also, as basically also some limits, when Trudeau, the son, because we say Trudeau, the Holy Spirit has not come yet, but we have Trudeau the Father, Trudeau the Son. Hopefully, we don't get Trudeau the Holy Spirit, la Sainte Trinité. But I think I don't know if you have a religious background, but we used to be like la Sainte Trinité. Anyway, I know when I came in 2015, everybody was excited about Trudeau. And at that time, we had a lot of doubt, but then we got kind of seduced by him. Now the balance has shifted very negatively. But I think, obviously, for one mistake he really made, is that when he pronounced that Canada was the first post-national state and didn't have identity of its own. You can guess that it's not what we're going to be living in the current year with what's happening. So it turned multiculturalism was a nation-building ideology, which had worked well for 40 years, and it turned it into a post-national identity statement. It's not the same thing. Being multiculturalism, because it's to your core identity with a strong Canadian identity, it's not the same thing as being a post-national state. And again, I don't know how much it had. It's difficult to say how much it had impact on the actual policy, because we all know that policy maker at the state level, not the state, I mean the bureaucracy level, react very slowly and things don't change too much. But at least ideologically, it was a strong message, and it was combined with something I'll cover in the last part of the conference, which is the rise in immigration. So it was not an excellent choice, let's say that. And also, I think it's not peculiar to Canada, but we seem to be seeing more inter-community conflict related to international political situation. It's not the Palestinian Jewish thing is not specific; it's happening everywhere. But it's challenging the policy in a way, because people would say if multiculturalism had been a full success, then people would feel Canadian first. And they would be Canadian having different opinion about foreign policy. but it's not the way it happened. It's lived by people. I mean, there are some people, sector of the Jewish sector and some sector of the Muslim sector who would be in the middle like this, but most of them, they're reacting first and foremost with loyalty from the country of origin. In the case of Jewish people, it's not even the country of origin. Sometimes it's a country of reference, because a lot of them were third generation Canadian, and although they may go for the summer camp, they send their kids summer camps in Israel, they're not planning on living in Israel. But that shows, and we had also, so I mentioned that also, but to a lesser extent, some tension between the community in the South Asian community, but to a lesser extent. So it shows that we're in a moving, they did not achieve fully what we hoped. And if I look finally at the economic level, is that although it may have contributed to some good aspect, when we look at Porter, did qualify Canada as a vertical mosaic. It's been a classic, as opposed to the American melting pot. And we used to say we're mosaic. Then Porter, the sociologist, say you're mosaic, but we're vertical mosaic. So we can move. But the vertical mosaic has moved in 50 years. And first it moves because the European immigrants have moved up. But I would even say the visible minority are no more an homogeneous group. South Asian are doing very well. Chinese, Asian overall are doing very well. So the mostly the racialized minority who are having more problem are still Latin American and Black people. Although there are some difference, class difference as in every way. But they've been redefined, but it still has some relevance. It's still a vertical mosaic. It's a very different. The colors are places somewhere else, but we still. For some racial group, what we see is that it does not decrease after generation, because we more or less expect that the first generation migrants will go downward mobility, although it's a pity because we're losing some of their competence, but at least it can be expected. But when you look at second, third generation, normally everybody is up in the second generation, but it does not apply to all racial minority. And I'm not even speaking about native people, which are not theoretically covered under multiculturalism. And overall, what we can say also, I mentioned that, is that although Canada has good indicators of mobility for immigrant groups, the indicator should be even better, given the fact that until the last 10 years, we had 80% of our immigration was planned, even 90%. So it should be much higher, but it's still good. Changing context and its potential impact. So I'm going to speak about three major trends and try to look at what impact it will have on the policy. This part, I'm sorry, some people heard it a little bit last time. I mean, we've witnessed a major transformation in the Canadian immigration dynamics. We had an explosion of volumes. We had more than 1,002,076, 400 something immigrants in 2023. While in 2014, we had a little less than 300,000. And this includes both permanent and temporary migration. It was largely created by the Trudeau government under an ideology of eventually bringing Canada to 100 million population by 2050 or something like that, a think tank which is very popular. Also to the fact that during Trump #1, he would say that we would welcome any immigrant that Trump did not want. He made an appeal. But it should not be all, to be frank, when we look at the debate, it was also created by the provincial government and by the universities and cities, especially the temporary migration movement. So it is not that simple that said federal government invaded us with many, many immigrants, because actually, except for asylum seeker, the temporary migration is composed of students and of temporary worker. And the small business, especially outside the big cities, they're thriving for manpower, because there's been a shortage of manpower after COVID. I don't know why, because people didn't die that much, but still, there's been a lot of shortage of manpower. And the universities were asking more and more foreign students. So this movement was actually a collective responsibility, but with an impetus for the federal government. But the main thing is not so much the numbers as the shift from the permanent and temporary migrants for the impact of multiculturalism. Because you're guessing if multiculturalism is to strengthen Canadian identity with a definition of diversity, you need to have people who have an intention of staying and wanting to learn about the country. And in 2023, for example, 63% of the flux is temporary migration. So people who are likely to be sent back. But it's not that simple. You could say they won't change any identity in Canada because they're likely to be sent back. It's not that simple. We all know that most people will stay. But they won't. There's major impact on service shortage, like housing, the problem of learning French, especially in Quebec. A lot of those migrants are more keen to learn English, and it has brought also a drop in public opinion. 66% say now that the recent poll says there's too much immigrant, which was something we never experienced in Canada before that. Then they came back after 10 years of this policy of let's have more is the better, and it doesn't matter if you're permanent or temporary, welcome. Then they, seeing the consequences, they went back in a very rapid and unplanned attempt to reduce volume. Especially for temporary migrants. This I've covered in more details in December. So, but it's very bad for any immigration policy to be unpredictable. You can imagine as students, some students were there, they were expecting that they would get access to citizenship. They're studying now, they don't know if their permit will be renewed. So it brought a mess. And I was looking at the Liberal party platform for this election that just happened 2 weeks ago. Even less, 10 days ago, but the 28th of April. And I noticed that the same thing about the reduction of the number of temporary migrants is prominent feature in the program. So there was no difference whether the Conservative would have been elected or the Liberal. There is a consensus that immigration level will have to go down. But the problem is, given we live in the Trump #2 area, how much can we implement this? Before the election of Trump, it was thinkable that we could go back to temporary migration, lower level. But what has been happening in the last 3 months is that refugee claimants have started to congregate at the border. The number has risen again, and most of those people have family in Canada, especially in Quebec, because they're Haitian from Haiti, because it targeted especially the Black community and Latin American community. Latin American community maybe and they're going before they have to be targeted. Maybe some of them will go to Mexico, but everybody who's from Haiti will try to go to Canada. They have family. They have a major spokesperson like Dany Laferrière, who is a major writer in Quebec and also member of one of the only Canadian member of l'Académie Française. So it's a very well-known figure who said already. One politician said we cannot accept all the misery of the world, and then Dany Laferrière went in the newspaper saying, how can you say Haïtiens are, les Haïtiens ne sont pas la misère, Haïtiens are not the misery of the world with the asset for Quebec. And a lot of people are starting to say, we have between what could curtain the movement was we had the safe third country agreement with US. That meant that if a refugee claimant had been introduced to a safe country, which was US at that time, then Canada was not obliged to receive them for refugee. But now you cannot at the same time hate Trump and at the same time pretend that US is a safe country agreement. So even the nationalists, and very strongly in Quebec, people don't like Trump, but even any Canadian nationalists, they don't like Trump. If you're against Trump policy, you cannot say that the actual climate now So people would contest the third country agreement. I don't know if the federal government will denounce it with US, but the legitimacy of saying we don't have to take those people because they're in a safe country as refugee claimant is already very weak. So I can imagine it won't improve in the next month. Another thing that has happened is a surge in Canadian nationalism following the election of President Trump and of his many threats. You're aware of the 51st state, but also the economic threats. And there's a percentage, the rising of citizens proud to be Canadian has been rising a lot. But it was already rather high in English Canada, 67%. So it rise up. It's now a 67. It's raised to 9. But in Quebec, it gained 13 points and it got to 58% of Quebecers saying they're proud to be Canadian. This is something you've never seen. So it really shows that the Trump effect is having a building of civic identity. The grassroots is everywhere. Buy Canadian products. I see people who never now even the major banner, the major department store, they all have it's Canadian or at least Canadian or at least not US. People are not all the older people who used to go what we call them the snowbird. The snowbird has not planned. Are not the level of snowbird are the people from all Canada who spend their summer in Florida. It's a major wave. I know Trump doesn't need us, but he didn't realize Florida needs us. So we are all there. So this also the airline that go to US have drops. So the posting of Canadian flags. I know it's a very it's an anecdotal, but people are reporting that it's selling everywhere. Something, especially in Quebec, we've never seen that. So it's very interesting. And this explained the unlikely re-election of the Liberal Party for a fourth term. It's, I think, until even the Chrétien did not have a fourth term. I think must be the first in the 1950s. Somebody had fourth. I'm not even sure. I would try to check, but it's an unknown thing. Normally, you do 2 terms. By a miracle, you do a third term. Chrétien did the third term, for example, but most of the time you don't. And just before Trump got elected, we were expecting, the conservative were running 20 points ahead, and then with the Trump election, this was all redefined, and Mark Carney was seen as the savior. And what is interesting is that it is largely to Quebec, usually nationalist votes, that this government was elected. The popularity of the Liberal was less than expected, was higher than expected, but less than expected the week before in Ontario, where Conservative came not too bad. Conservatives kept their strong hold in the West, and it's basically because in Quebec, people who used to vote Bloc, and the number of people who were voting for the Bloc is a so-called independentist party, but he's been liking being in Ottawa for 30 years, so it's not that militant, but still they are independent in their platform. And this vote the strategic vote went to the Liberal, and most of his deputation, he failed his majority government because Ontario was more conservative than expected. But just to say that it's very something we haven't seen. So when you look, certainly we've escaped to the conservative government would have been maybe less pro-multiculturalism, although nobody is totally anti-multiculturalism in Canada, in political party. But the Liberal Party being there, you can expect, and I'll say that the policy will be in place. But what is interesting, I look at the political party. I know the program of the political party does not say necessarily what a political party will be doing, because it may change. But there's no mention of multiculturalism as a policy in the document. But there is a commitment to uphold the Charter of Rights, the reconciliation with Indigenous people, and the fight against racism. So I think they will go on this, a targeted approach. but not necessarily directly. But again, I don't know if this will stand with Carney when Carney will develop his new cabinet. But when he had his cabinet, when he was an interim, when Trudeau left before he got the election, the former department was called Canadian Heritage, under which you had multiculturalism, and it was renamed Culture and Canadian Identity. So clearly, we're in a nationalistic move in Canada. We've hardly known for very long. And we are in a time where we're going to have migration, major migration issue, because we wanted to put the level down, and at the same time we know that we'll have to take more because of what's happening at the border. And last thing which is happening is that I think even if the election of the Liberal may give the impression that we got back into a kind of social democratic consensus, so we're not going far right or far left. Nevertheless, there's increased polarization. Although there's a strong, Trump is disliked very much because he's been very aggressive towards Canada. Especially, including Canada as a 51 first. But that doesn't mean that some of his meritocratic, anti-woke, anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion rhetoric initiative does not hold some popularity in some sector. So it is difficult to document. If I take a few things that I've gotten, if you look, for example, in the there's at least one English Canadian and one French Canadian media, Journal de Montréal and the National Post, who they're not pro-Trump, but they tend to they're denouncing DI initiative often, and they're having more critical. They say Trump is doing the right thing, except with his relation with Canada. So, and I would say, but most of it. Of this is often not directed so much as the dimension of multiculturalism as it relates to immigrant communities, but mostly about the gender issue. Gender issue with the transition, trans identity. This is what the most target of DI policy, because DI policy includes all type of diversity. But there is some popularity we cannot deny, and we don't know how. It could explain to a certain extent that the vote, the Conservative, was a little higher. But although Pierre Poilievre is not against multiculturalism, but he's certainly against some of, especially and he's not against women's rights, some of the policy towards trans identity and LGBTQ. So that may explain. But most of the vote in Ontario was probably because they felt that economically it was doing so bad that they were confident that they would be more popular. But the main new factor is that now it's Quebec that want to separate is Alberta, and they have money and oil. No, there's although all the Canadian provinces have been on board, except Alberta. Alberta is worried about the trade that will happen with the U.S. And they worry: will we use oil as a bargaining power? And the prime minister, the woman prime minister there, she went directly to Washington. She's trying to set her own deal. Now she said that she will allow a referendum. She says she's not for the independence of Alberta, but she will allow a referendum to be held. And when we look at the support for annexation to the U.S., it's 9% in Canada. So it means 9% of people think it would be a good thing we got part of U.S., but 23% of people in Alberta. So it shows strong regional differences. And in Alberta, almost 70% of people voted, 65% voted Conservative, while the Conservative vote is 41%. So this Western polarization is likely to be more important than any multicultural polarization. But on the contrary, the French fact is likely to come again as central in Canadian politics. It had been withering away with mostly the West and multiculturalism. First of all, if you want to say that Canadians have a different identity from the U.S., after you've named our Medicare, which is not working very well. So people can say we better pay than waiting 2 years to get treated. So in Medicare is something, social program is something, but the main things that makes impossible the integration of Canada to US at the identity level is the fact that 25% of people speak French, and that it's a core identity. So it becomes more important, and also, although the liberal minority government can survive with 7 NDP elected people, they lost their status as a party, the New Democratic Party, because they don't have but they will rely on the Bloc Québécois a lot to make alliance. That won't please the West. Imagine the federal government making alliance with the Quebec Independentist Party too, but they will be central. And I would say, I was surprised once he got nominated. Before the 2 first visits at par that was going to Britain and going to France, and in that way, I think he was stating, as the Harper government had done in the 2000s, that this dual identity, our core allies are French and France and Britain. So this is the context where we're living now. Change, polarization, high nationalism, but polarization coming from the West, and high level of migration. So what hypothesis for multiculturalism in the future? Okay, first of all, it's a landmark of Canadian identity, and it won't be challenged radically. You won't see tomorrow morning somebody say it's the end of multiculturalism or multiculturalism was failure. It's there to stay, at least at the federal level. It won't move for the next as long as the Liberal government is there, and even if it was a conservative government. But they will probably be, and all these are hypotheses, a slight ideological evolution. We will most likely go back more to multiculturalism as having a common heritage that is pluralistic, as opposed to a diversity of culture and groups. I know it may seem, like casuistic, but it's not casuistic at all. For example, if I take, I could say, pluralistic common heritage means that the Taj Mahal belongs to every Indian, whether they're Muslim, Hindu, or Christian. That it's our common heritage, and our common heritage happens to be pluralistic. Very different from saying every group owns their own monument and their own landmarks and heritage. So, and I think that obviously with the context I've described, we're going to this. The post-national rhetoric is dead. I've never seen something dying so quick. And probably the more irritant of woke ideology, especially but which relates to gender diversity, not women, but gender diversity. And maybe if some of the, I would say, some of the policy, for example, we went from a sensibility from equity policy to quota policy in universities. We used to have only equity policy, which meant that at equal competency you had to hire underrepresented group. But then in some cases at the federal level, part of federal level, you could not offer, the position was reserved to a native person or to a visible minority person. So that is more like quota in a way that you cannot fill the position if you have no candidacy. So those things, they've been covered a lot in newspapers. So I'm under, although multiculturalism is a different policy from the subsidizing the Canadian chair and the Canadian universities, but I'm thinking there will be some withering of some of the more irritant anti-racist and this should have been a big quotation mark PowerPoint. I'm wondering, because they're so dependent of Quebec, how much they will have to accept the legitimacy of competing model of secularism. There's a major case court, the court now. The Secularism Act of Quebec is is going to the Supreme Court because some group have contested it, obviously. And the federal government is part of those groups, but they say they were going there not to discuss the matter itself, but the fact that the notwithstanding clause was used before adopting the policy. I'm sorry for the people who are legal expert, but we have in the Canadian Constitution a clause called the notwithstanding clause. That means that any provincial government can invoke that they're suspending some element of the Charter of Rights for 5 years because it is an urgent matter to do so. But normally this clause was always invoked only after a piece of legislation was turned down by the Supreme Court. In recent years, the government has started to do it preventively. And this has been the case also in Ontario of anti-labor law. It's not only a religion thing, but this time, the federal government is saying we're going to court not because we want to argue about Quebec being legitimate or not, to have its own model of secularism, which is less accommodating or more ambitious neutrality of the state, but we want to contest the fact that no provincial government should use the notwithstanding clause before. But we'll see. It will be interesting if it moves a little bit. Certainly, I would say if the Conservative have been there, the Conservative would have been clearly that they respect totally the right of Quebec government to have its own version of secularism. Now we're under the Liberal. The Liberal, even Carney, has a strong commitment to the Charter of Rights, and they don't like to have the notwithstanding clause, which was a compromise that Trudeau, the father, made when they repatriated the Constitution from the British government in 1982. So we'll see. There will certainly be, when you look at discourse and grant program, because multiculturalism is basically a grant program, it gives money to people to change society. There will certainly be more stress on strengthening the sense of belonging and intercultural exchange. I'm looking forward that in a few months we'll see, that you must explain how your project is helping for identity. There will be much more stress put on settlement and integration services for newcomers. This does not come from the same budget. Settlement and integration service for newcomers are under the immigration department, while multiculturalism is under Canadian Emeritus. But you all know, as I said, it's always our own money. They say it's not the government money, it's the citizen money. So if they have to put much more money in integration, they will probably put less money in multiculturalism. And I think there will be a stronger stress of the original multiculturalism in a bilingual framework, not the original song and dance, but the bilingual framework. They probably will. They already announced that they want to have more stress on immigration in Francophone minority community. But this is from the immigration department. But for multiculturalism, I'm pretty sure they're going to insist very much on the learning of both languages and the fact that we are a bilingual country because they need it as their identity flag, especially in their relationship with the US. And the debate around the policy will continue. But it won't be a big issue. The visibility, because there are more pressing issues. The two pressing issues will be the newcomers and the managing the flux of new arrival and managing the relationship with the US. So this does not open and eventually managing the tension with the Western Canada. So these are three issues that are very different from the multiculturalism as a new immigrant origin group. It won't be very visible. It won't be a priority, and they will certainly have less money. They will have less money because there are more pressing issues, and also because we are in difficult times. I mean, honestly, we don't know how it will look like. Now, we haven't felt the tariff impact, but we will eventually felt. And now they're announcing about the movie, which is very important for Canada, the production of movie. So that's my prediction about what will happen to multiculturalism. So it will be there. It will change slightly a little bit the stress and probably less visible and less money. So.
Thank you, Professor Bakindra. It's a fascinating presentation, very comprehensive. It's not just really meant for the students of Canadian studies, but also anyone who is interested in the multiculturalism, diversity, and managing conflicts within the societies. You are absolutely correct in the way the multiculturalism policy, idea, ideology is context specific. And every country tries to define it according to its own preferences and also in the context of the state policy. You also given us, you highlighted, I think, Canada stands out to be one of the models for the rest of the world to pursue multiculturalism as a policy. Maybe the other country may be Australia.
And India too, in its own way, but not
certainly.
for immigration.
Not immigration. But certainly, I think, and you really pointed to all the positive aspects, but you also listed limits. One tentatively developed a kind of very uneasiness when you really said the Trump factor looms large in the Canadian policy. And I really was thinking that, oh, this is one model that really works better and good for the rest of the world. Is also under stress because of this Trump's emergence as the hawkish leader, American leader, not the world leader now. But then eventually, when it came to the hypothesis, I think that we re-energize ourselves and say that look, there is a positive sort of trend emerging. It's not everything is bad in Canada, but I think certainly there is a positive. There are challenges. I think the erosions are challenges that may not lead to a complete dismantling of the policy. Certainly, the dismantling is something which is beyond the purview of the polity because it is a state-built policy. It is built in the state policy, which is not easy to really get away with that. So I think you ended with a positive note. Certainly, you highlighted frankly the challenges Canadian policy, multicultural policy faces. So thank you so much for the very insightful presentation. And the floor is open. Please sort of identify yourself very briefly in one line and then brief questions.
I'm Dr. Shubha sir. I'm a faculty in the Center for Indo-Pacific Studies.
Sorry, Center for what?
Indo-Pacific.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm actually specializing on working on Australia's immigration policy and multiculturalism. And I want to know whenever I study about Australia's multiculturalism, I keep drifting towards Canada's multiculturalism. And I wanted to make a comparative study out of it, but I was thinking what could be the comparative or contrasting factors of Canada's multiculturalism in comparison to Australia's multiculturalism, and for that matter, even US multiculturalism, because the three of them are in different countries.
Absolutely.
Do you want to take a few more?
Yes, a few more maybe.
A few more questions for us.
But let me just yes.
So, Professor Nafe, would you like to? Yeah, please identify yourself.
Hello, I'm Radhika, and I'm pursuing PhD.
Speak on the mic.
Yeah.
Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm Radhika, and I'm pursuing PhD at the center. Thank you, ma'am, for very, very comprehensive presentation. Any question that was arising in my mind was later answered by you in the same presentation. But yet, I have one question.
Yes.
So, you mentioned later the presentation about Etosa. I was curious what kind of identities are emerging. This Canada West versus Canada East, the Rockies, the Prairies versus the Atlantic Canada, the Maritimes. So, this assertion, is it economic? Is it regional? And does it impact the existing identity scenario in
Okay. I understand. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
These are my fam because they're the two Canadian study, and she's the Quebec study. They represent. Hello.
First of all, thank you so much for your comprehensive lecture. I am Preeti Sharma, pursuing my PhD in Canadian Studies only. And my question is that the 45th federal election of
Yes.
Canada made a very severe impact not only on Canada but on the whole world. Actually, it came something out of blue, which was not decided or predicted by political scientists also. And the polling which happened, the exit polls which happened, didn't predict this picture in Canada. So my question regarding to multiculturalism is that how do you see multiculturalism in the Mark Carney's era, as his background is economy and as a global figure of economy and globalist, as he has the economics and globalist background, how do you see Mark Carney's perspective on multiculturalism? Apart from that, in the 45th federal election, we have also seen that there's a polarization of politics.
Sorry.
Polarization of politics in Canada also, like it's divided into two parts, the liberals and the conservatives.
Yeah.
So how do you think that this will impact multiculturalism of Canada? Don't you think that this will deepen the dividends in Canada regarding multiculturalism?
No, No, I'm going to answer first and I'll go back. I wouldn't say so, because in a way, certainly, maybe if McCartney had been elected, before, instead of Trudeau, you may in 2015, maybe he would have been more into this post-national type of multiculturalism. But now the strength is so much back on Canadian identity that he will necessarily, and he's a strong holder of a Charter of Rights, he's a strong holder of a fight against racism. So it's very less likely that he will touch the Canadian multiculturalism policy. And he will certainly be aiming a lot of presenting it in the former version, which was as the beacon of Canadian identity, our bilingual nature and our multicultural nature at the same time. I think unless everything gets, let's say in 2-3 years, I don't. It's very difficult. Let's say in 2 years, Trump loses momentum because he loses the one of the assembly. He has a local election, not local, but I mean not the Senate. The other thing. The election in the US in 2 years, it is for the assembly. How do you call that in English?
Senate.
No, not the Senate, the other one. The House of the House. So, but 2 years is too late to think. But until this time, we're going to be in harsh negotiation, and I don't see how we could do to see it different. It's going to be multiculturalism. It's not very visible because now we're discussing mostly the Canadian identity. The bilingual nature will be important, but I don't see why you would touch in any manner the multiculturalism. And I would say even the conservative of Pierre Poilievre, they were not aiming at touching multiculturalism. They had the same thing in their political platform. I would say the main difference probably we'll see when it goes to Supreme Court is how much we allow multiculturalism to accommodate competing vision of secularism. This is an issue, and obviously the liberals are much more into centralized vision of multiculturalism than the conservative. The conservative already say they wouldn't go to court and they respect Quebec rights to have its own model of secularism. But this is, it's still under the guise of multiculturalism. Again, also because we need, and that's answer partly what about the regional tension, but I'll go back. I think also the stress on interculturalism and intercultural exchange will be stronger in the policy. Not so much because of the immigrant, but because also they feel that this regional tension is happening. But I don't expect, as I explained, I don't expect major impact, except they'll have more pressing issue to deal with. And less money. Now, if I go back to regionalism, yes, it is an interesting movement. Us Quebecers, we used to believe that only nation could qualify for independence, and Quebec could qualify as a nation because we have a different history, a different ethnic background. We were conquered. We never joined. It's an argument. We were conquered by the British Crown, for sure. Now, whether we agree for the Constitution, but because no Canadian agreed for the Constitution, so we're not, in 1867, there was no referendum. So neither the French Canadian nor the English Canadian ever agreed to be part of Canada. It was an agreement between the elected official. So, but the argument goes that we were conquered and we never agreed to be part of Canada, blah, blah, blah. But at least it's true we were conquered by the British. Whether we were not agree, we did not agree more or less than the other Canadian to be part of Canada. Canada, 1867, was the creation by mostly economic power and political elites. In part to counteract the expansion of the US in the West. So it was already a part of it. But anyway, we used to think that it was impossible that Alberta develop a genuine independence movement because it's mostly based on the economy. It's difficult to say that they have a different history, but you can always find that yes, true. Most of their background is not French or English. Their background is mostly Western European, Eastern European. I'm sorry, and also I think, but the sense of alienation that it's very strong. I think it is. They're afraid about what will happen because they know that they're afraid about the fight against climate change agenda of the liberal. this is a major difference that has nothing to do with multiculturalism, with the conservative. You know, conservative, they're a little bit like Trump on that issue. He used to say, you know, they're always repeating the slogan that you can have your own, you're allowed to drive your own car, having a nice house in the secure neighborhood, and buying your first house. So they're more like lower middle class and working class. Funny enough, conservative has a discourse which is working class and lower middle class, and in which the right to drive your car and was very central. So the liberal being re-elected means that although they say that because of Trump they may allow a new pipeline, Carmi was open to the pipeline but it has to be acceptable. And Quebecois, we were very hypocrites on that, because we consume the petrol from Alberta, but it comes to get refined in the US, and we buy it from the US like this. So it's hypocrisy. Although we're more climate respectful because we have electricity. So again, all those things, the Canadian petroleum, the Quebec electricity, would it be played in our negotiation with Trump? So everybody is a little worried, for sure. Also in Quebec, we have the protection of farmer that was protected under the last agreement, not Alena, but the new one. I never know his name, the SEUM. But again, that could be on the table. So everybody is afraid about what's going to be on the table when we really get to serious economic negotiation. So, but Alberta is especially feeling bad, because in a way they don't share the importance that the Liberal is given to the climate change action. They're targeted because they're the main producer of oil. They're very dependent on the US because the ecologist lobby prevented any pipeline to sell to Canada. I mean, you know, they say hell is paved by good intention, but what the ecologist lobby prevented, for ecological reasons, that we got the petroleum, good pipelines to get the petroleum from the West. So they have to sell it to the US, but actually, in the reality, the US sells it back to us. So the kind of, you know, wishful thinking on that area. So and the other thing also is that, which is very frustrating, is that, you know, we have jet lag in Canada, I mean, different time zone, and the government is always announced before the Albertans have finished voting. Because the way it is, the government is decided by Quebec and Ontario because of demographic reason. So it means that you're not finishing voting in Alberta, you already know what government you will have. This is a constant for 30 years. They don't know. I mean, they don't know. It's not shown on the TV, but they can go on the internet. But you know, the different TV, they announce the result once the polls are closed in Quebec, 9:30 at night. They're still voting in Alberta. They have the poll from Ontario and Quebec in a half an hour. By 10 o'clock, they know what is the government, and another half hour they know if it will be minority or majority. So, and then the Albertan people, theoretically, they're not supposed to know that because it's not announced. But nowadays, I mean, you don't need the TV to know what's happening. So it's frustrating, and also the fact that they voted they're so much conservative, and they feel that the election was stolen. I know it's something you don't like to use because it's very Trumpist, but the fact that let's say in January, they were expecting that they would have a major victory of the Conservative. Trudeau was 20 points backward to the Conservative. And now, with the Trump effect and Carmi coming, and all the Quebec vote leaving the Bloc Québécois and part of the NDP vote in the real West, I mean, in British Columbia, it's because actually the Conservative vote stayed the same. It was mostly always 40%, but normally with 40% of the vote, they would have gotten the government, because the other one would be split between the Bloc Québécois, the NDP, the New Democratic Party, and the Liberal. But the Liberal got those 20 points over because people rally, and as always, it's very surprising because a lot of people who were really a major figure for the independence of Quebec, they were saying, let's vote strategic for Carmi. So all those reasons makes that the Alberta feel more excluded than ever. But does it mean that they will go as far? I don't think they will have a majority to join US. But if I was Trump, I would pay attention to this and I would play this division, obviously.
Can I just have a follow-up? Academically, is it not an interesting case and phase in Canada for provincial and federal relations, wherein provinces are sort of pressurizing the federal government for various economic reasons?
Yes, they will have. What do you mean about your question? What?
Provincial and
Yes.
federal relations.
Yes. Well, I mean,
It's not an interesting phase in Canada of because
it's an interesting phase for sure because it has the question: do you whom should you prioritize, your allies or your foes? Should you keep your ally on board? That would mean more present of the French fact, or should you appease the West? I think Carney is a very skillful person. He certainly knows that he has to do something for the Western alienation. But at the same time, it's difficult for him to say, I'm going to give my on the policy against climate change. I think it's in the DNA. And his wife is especially a militant in the climate change NGOs and everything. So I don't think he will appease them to the level of they hope, but he will probably do something. Yes, but Canada is always an interesting case for the relationship between federal and provincial government. In one thing I did not mention, which is even worse, worse, not funny, that we have election in Quebec in 2026 at the state level. And the prediction is that the hard independence party, Parti Québécois, is going to win. And they want to hold a referendum, but all as usual, they have a strong vote, but very little people are favorable for independence. So it's going to be interesting. There's already some fight between the Independentist Party in Quebec and the Bloc Québécois because they felt that the Bloc Québécois was too eager to support Carney. Because when they have like 25 elected members instead of 35, they lost 10, but they had a stronghold. They kept their stronghold, and once the election came, Blanchet, who is a very moderate man, he said that until we settle this matter with Trump, Marc Carney can expect that the Bloc Québécois will support him. And then to the Independence Party in Quebec is very angry. They say it's invasion and everything. So it's an interesting thing. But for me, this is not too work. This is a little, noise, backward noise. But the problem of the economic threat is much more serious. Because we're sleeping with an elephant. You may not realize because U.S. is very far, but we like a mouse sleeping with an elephant. So even when the elephant was benevolent, we had to be careful when he was sleeping. But now he's not benevolent. Sorry, I'll take. Okay, there was a question about the federal. Okay, I'm not a specialist about Australia. My understanding is that the Australian policy, first of all, they don't have this language issue with French. They don't have. I would say the native issue is more important in Australia in a way that they compose, I think, a more important part of the population, and their situation is worse than in Canada. Although it's not part of multiculturalism, but it's an equation about how do you prioritize, multiculturalism versus reconciliation with native people. Which wouldn't be, but for the rest, I'm not. I went to Australia. I'm not up to date really to their policy, but I'm under the impression that it must be basically the same thing as But I couldn't. Maybe you know better than me. Did they evolve into really making it into a participation policy? I would think so. I don't think they would have a very much songs and dance type of thing. For the immigration policy, they know that. I know they raised their discriminatory system later than Canada. Canada had a discriminatory system until '69, in which the European were the most preferred nation. I think Australia, it came much later. Now most of the immigration is coming from Asia, if I understand well. But I couldn't really tell you how this. I've looked more about what's going on in Europe because we're influenced by Europe and Britain. But for Australia, maybe you know better. You probably know better than me.
Yeah, anyone? The next round of questions, if you have, please.
Yes, go.
Yeah, please.
Ma'am, my name is Emeritus. I'm a PhD student at Center for Canadian US Latin Studies. My question is how regime change reshapes the abstract of multiculturalism by altering the ideological foundations, legal frameworks, and political narratives. So, is it just a policy shift or a transformation on how cultural identity is conceptualized, valued, and recontested in Canadian society?
Okay.
So, in the backdrop of changing law.
Uh, it's but it's difficult to. Okay, sorry. Uh, nowadays it is especially difficult to see what is permanent and what is temporary and what is happening. Uh, in any area, not especially multiculturalism. We're living into, you say it was, when I say troubled times, that unpredictable time would be, it's totally unpredictable. I mean, everybody's is in a shock, I know it's true at the world level, but don't, like, it's such a shock for us to see, the changing relation with the US that it explained that we re-elected a liberal government. It explained that in a way, probably the multiculturalism, the surge in Canadian nationalism, which was unexpected, especially in the French sector, which is usually more Quebec identity first and more. That doesn't mean everybody's for independence, but the Quebec identity is usually much higher than the Canadian identity. So all this is moving so fast. I think immigrants are among. They were always people, immigrant and their descendants, second, third generation. They were always the people showing the higher level of Canadian identity. There's many studies that showed that the Quebecers were the least, English Canadian were the middle, because it was felt if you had a Canadian identity, it could be a little, fundamentalist or racist. And then the one who answered the higher, I feel proud to be Canadian, used to be immigrant groups. Because the converted are always more militant than the old one. So in a way, I don't expect immigrant groups to feel less Canadian. They will feel more Canadian. My only worry again is two things. If there's less money to the policy, it would probably mean that very good programs will be abandoned, especially programs to support fight against racism, the integration to the market, and equality. Certainly, if you have less money, it's clear. Less visibility doesn't mean you have less money, but in this context, we're going to have less money. Now, will there be a shift in ideology? Maybe not a shift, but for a while we're going to hear a lot about, as I said, multiculturalism is a beacon of Canadian identity. We are Canadian with a pluralistic heritage. It's most likely than hearing we are a post-national state. But again, I've not done. I would be curious. I haven't done on the way people see themselves. But is the grand policy changing? I know under the Harper government, 2000. Yes, the buzzword you have to tick in order to get your money. The buzzword changed, so you have to say you were contributing to common sense, civic values. So things like that. But NGO are very good at ticking the right boxes and doing the same thing. So, and at the level of ideology, I think the maybe even there will be less debate about multiculturalism because it's not the talk of the day. So, except with the very publicized issue of secularism, because it will go in the Supreme Court, beautiful Canada and the federal government is we accommodating everybody, or if the Supreme Court say no, this secularism act goes too far, then we'll probably hear that we alienated and we'll be competing Western alienation against Quebec alienation. But except for the secularism issue, I don't see multiculturalism being a hot debate for the next 2 years. Less money, little change in ticking the buzzword you have to tick in your application, and little stress on when people will speak, politicians will speak, but no major change.
Any more questions, sir? Would you like to? Yeah, please.
Because Ajita is saying that I must ask at least something.
I asked you first, sir.
I have nothing to I admire Mari for many reasons, and one of the reasons is perhaps in the 20th time, she makes her presentation so well structured and so scientifically designed. And the charm of hearing her is complex concepts. She explains them in very simple words.
Thank you.
Actually, this is something I have retired. This is something I learned from. I try to learn from you how to put complex ideas into simple words so that it convey the message. The lecture is almost over, so I'm taking you out of
Yes, good.
this multiculturalism business. We can not copy. There were so many good, insightful ideas. You know, we have discussed something about new government and the new challenges and the turbulent times.
Yes, okay.
Not only for Canadian multiculturalism, but Canada as a nation. Canada being offered to become the 51st state. So on this Tuesday, once again Trump offered Carney a beautiful marriage. These are his words. I have followed the elections and this US-Canada tussle very closely in the last 2 months. And then, since you are from Quebec, you are from Canada, how serious is the threat? Justin Trudeau, immediately after the US presidential election, had gone to Miami at the ranch Mar-a-Lago, and he had taken a very strong team with him. And after that, he had publicly said the threat is quote unquote very serious. And don't take this Trump's outspokenness on this idea of building Canada. 51st state is something really very serious. This is what he has said. And I am trying to explore the seriousness of this threat.
Okay.
I followed the elections as closely as a retired professor could do, since I have nothing else to do. So I could do it a little more closely than many others. Something which surprised me during this election in Canada was, after a very long period, this disease emerged once again, that Western Canada is feeling alienated. I thought economic development has taken care of this element. This belonged to the days of 70s and 90s, when the Western Canadians used to feel that they are being treated in the financial terms, in terms of representation in the House of Commons, somewhat shadily. Ontario and Quebec, they are occupying all the attention. But this election again, alienation. And then you have Trump's threat. Only the other, I think the kind of parties that you have in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, in British Columbia, they are very different kind of conservatives. Premier of Alberta has introduced a bill in the local legislation seeking separation, allowing our own conservative rank and file to start making noise that we want to get out of Canada. You are coming from Canada. I would really love to see your comments on this.
Okay.
Maybe I'm thinking in elaborated terms.
No, but I think I've covered some of it. But first of all, I think. Sorry. Let's go back to the 51st state. I think Trump is serious about it. But when you look at the right now, and the same thing for the threat, I think our main hope is the internal U.S. politics. Because, for example, there were a recent poll about how much of Trump's idea is supported. You know, his approval rate is going down, and depending on which policy, and the policy which get the less approval at 9% of Americans is making Canada into a 51st state. So all Americans are laughing. So but again, he has the only policy he has a very good rating is the border and the expulsion, which is sad, but that's the way it is. Yeah, he goes over 50 on this. And when you look at tariff even is under 50, because maybe I don't remember by heart, but because I think that when I was mentioning the election in 2 years, is that right now Trump is unchallenged because he has the two assembly, the Senate. He won't lose the Senate, but most likely he will lose the House in 2 years. So it's some people are even say we should pretend to negotiate the new economic agreement, the SEOM, but we should actually wait. And Kanye is intelligent, so he doesn't say what he will do, and he doesn't say what he says is not what he will do. And so he say we'll negotiate quickly, but there is a lot of opinion makers saying just don't do anything, and in 2 years we'll have power. And you see him getting in and out for the economic thing every time he gets a phone call from the big auto industry, then he goes back on the tariffs. And but I think he's serious about the 51 state. But I don't imagine a minute that Americans are interested. Not to mention the fact that imagine that given our politics, it will mean that the Republican will never be in power for the rest of the history of the United States, because we will all vote. It would be a block of 35 or 40. Let's say we huge country, but let's say for the population we get like California. We are pretty much the size of California, 40 million, something like that, 45 millions. I mean, maybe we will let one Republican. So the day Canada becomes part of the US is the heaven days of the Democrat forever. And this has been put. So I'm not. It's not a serious. I mean, it's a serious threat in the way that he's a nuisance, but it's not. It's not a serious threat, and he's not going to. I would be more worried about Greenland, though. Greenland, because Greenland is very important for the Arctic, for its security. But I'm not worried that he will invade Canada, but he may make life very hard for us because of his tariff. And that's it. Now about the Western alienation. I'm not that surprised, because even before the election, when everybody thought that the Conservative would be elected, I always forget her name. This lady, she did her own personal trip to Washington, and I think they are fragile because they know that our export of petroleum is major to the U.S. and that she's trying, and at the same time she's afraid that the U.S. will tax it. Or she's afraid that we may use it in the war, because remember that the other Conservative in Ontario say he was ready to even shut the electricity from Ontario to North England if it helped. But it's not a big sacrifice, because the role of hydroelectricity for Ontario is in its economy is not major. But for Quebec, we haven't said that because we don't want. It's a lot of our export is electricity. But it would seem that if you have a government which is pro environment, say against the climate change, it's most likely that they will try to play with the petroleum that play with the hydroelectricity on the gaming table. So she's very afraid of that. They're very disappointed because they were so sure that they would have a conservative government. They're very disappointed. But will they go? And she has not actually introduced a bill for separation. She has introduced a bill allowing that the number of signatures for a referendum be decreased to 1,160,000. I never know how to say the numbers in English. 160,000. It used to be like 500,000, and now it's. And she said that if the citizen brings a bill against separation, she will. But will she be part of the yes or the no? It remains to be seen. But again, it's an interesting thing. But we're very fragile. Everything can evolve very well. It has become almost. It has nothing to do with multiculturalism. But if you're interested mostly in politics, normally a Canadian prime minister may be meeting a U.S. president wouldn't make full-time TV. On the day I was leaving, I was taking the plane at 7 o'clock, and from 11:30 to 2 o'clock when I decided I needed to take my taxi to the airport. I mean, we are on direct. The only thing we are seeing is that the gate of the White House, and the thing. Mark Carney waiting for his arrival. And all those experts, I mean, they're on TV all the time, and then every movement was scrutinized. I think the good thing about Carney is that he doesn't speak too much. And that's the big, with somebody like Trump is the best thing. I mean, you can see that he's used that as a he was the the Bank of Canada, the bank, and he knows that any word you say could bring the market up and down. So he doesn't speak much. When he speaks, it's clear. I mean, when Trump said he didn't need anything from us, and then he answered, "Yes, we only your major partner," and he showed and I see this reflected a lot on Facebook, in American media and things. I mean, I think he made a point. And when he said, he's good. He said, you are a real estate, you're a great president, you're gonna make major change, blah blah blah. But you know that something are not for sale, like the White House, the palace in London and Canada. But let's see, But there's gonna be major economic change, but it's difficult to say.
Right. Trump is a good character for enjoying the laugh. He said that Indian Pakistan, fighting for what's it, 1,000 years or more. I think he's correct. There's a wrong history somewhere.
I know, but he says, it's incredible. I mean, now you're not even trying to see what he says wrong. You're trying to see if he ever says something right. What did he say also, which was ridiculous, like that Egypt and US share common history since the beginning of time or something like that. But we laugh, but I think it's good we laugh, and I see also in the US a lot of people are laughing, and that's a good thing. Although because you have to keep your sanity, because sometimes But if I go back to multiculturalism, I think the main immediate threat is the threat to migrants now. This we cannot laugh about that. I mean, still now we haven't fed. Probably Canada unemployment will raise. Probably we'll go more into depth because we'll have to cover some sector that are disappearing. I mean, there's going to be economic people who will have less money, but still, I mean, it's a very unpleasant situation. But I'm not expecting that we'll go back to 1929. People begging in the street to get the food. But if you look at the situation of migrants in the US, that's why I was saying it's more. I don't imagine how long can Canada pretend that US is a safe third country. So that means we will have to take more migrants, especially that they have family there, because the community are well implemented in Canada. Because it's horrible what he's doing. I mean, it's absolutely incredible what he's doing to migrants now. I mean, people who are legally there. I'm not speaking about illegal migrants. It takes people who have the working permits, people who have been accepted, like the Haitian. They have been accepted, totally legal. They have job and everything. He decided the right of the soul, although it's been contested in the court. But this is very worrisome, really, the way he treats the migrants and sending them back to some Salvador agreement with the El Salvador prison, which is known as something like Midnight Express, if you remember this movie about Turkey in the 1970s, prison, Midnight Express type of prison. This is a very worrisome situation. Even more than what is happening in Canada, and it will certainly increase the number of people who want to come to Canada, and it will put more pressure on our finance, more pressure on multiculturalism, because people will say, you had said you would reduce the number of migrants so we can integrate them better, but now how can you be against Trump and at the same time not accept those people at the border? It's going to be a lot of pressure for Carney to decide how he balanced his commitment to lower immigration, and the fact that many sectors of society would say, how can you refuse those people at the border?
Right, then we should bring the session to close. I think you have a lot of thanks to propose.
Yes, finally. So, all good thanks. Yeah. On behalf of the School of International Studies, I'm honored to extend our heartfelt appreciation to Professor Mari McAndrew. Your insightful and nuanced engagement with the theme of multiculturalism has deeply enriched our understanding. Scholars of international studies, especially the Canadian studies, they stand to gain immensely from the perspectives you shared with us today.
Thank you.
We sincerely hope you will continue to enrich us with your scholarship on multiculturalism in Canada, a field to which you have contributed so meaningfully. I would also like to thank our faculty colleagues, students for their presence and enthusiasm. I would like to thank, especially acknowledge Professor Nafe for being here today. You were one of the initiators of this program, so it means a lot to us.
And a friend of Canada and Quebec that has visited often.
Yes. A special word of gratitude goes to Professor Matu, who is not here today, but he has been the cornerstone of this initiative. Professor Sahadevan,
Yes,
we are
thank you.
grateful for you, grateful for your conducting this session with so much elan and grace. And I would also like to acknowledge, last but not the least, our dedicated faculty team. Professor Preeti Singh is the head of that committee, and a team of volunteers, student volunteers, whose commitment has ensured the smooth and successful execution of today's event. We look forward to welcoming you all again when we resume the series after the summer break. So we'll
Excellent.
again meet very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much for very good organization.